teaching and developing writing skills. Dr. Peter Watkins, Associate Professor at the University of Portsmouth, co-author of the Shelta Course and a leading voice in language teaching and pedagogy.
Welcome everyone to a new session of our STEP webinar. So I'm Soaz Hom, the Deputy Academic of Monglish Academy and الجلسة. So I'd like to present this session today, and of course to welcome Dr. Peter Watkins, today's webinar. Welcome, Dr. Peter.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
We're truly honored to have you, of course, today, and a warm welcome as well to our participants, dedicated ELT professionals from around the globe. So we wish you all an insightful and enriching session, of course. And Dr. Peter, you may start. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First of all, it's lovely to see so many people here. I can still see that one or two people are joining. And it's nice to see that some of you, looking at the chat messages, were here last week when I was talking about reading. So I hope you found that useful. And what we talked about in the reading session was the need to maybe go a bit beyond what typical course books offer us. Typical course books tend to offer us a reading text, true false questions, multiple choice questions, things like that. And we talked about the need to do a bit more than that, to try to develop reading fluency, for example. And I gave you a few activities that would produce reading fluency and increase reading fluency. The need to teach reading strategies, or to perhaps use a more task-based approach where we start with a problem to solve, which requires reading texts in order to solve it. So that was sort of the thrust, the main things that we talked about last week. And obviously, reading and writing are absolutely linked. You know, you can't have one without the other. One presupposes the other. So today we're going to talk a little bit about teaching writing. Now, as I say, it's great that so many of you are here. The chat function is available to you. I'm going to ask you a few questions as we go along. So please use the chat function to put in responses to any prompts I give you. With 370-ish people in the room, it's obviously difficult for me to necessarily read every response. So please, please, please don't be offended if I don't read your particular response out. It's just not possible to always keep up with all of them. The other thing you have available to you, I believe, is the Q&A, the question and answer function. So I will leave plenty of time at the end of the talk to answer specific questions that you've got. So if you put them in the chat, I might miss particular questions you want answered. So if you want to ask me a question, it's probably better to put it in the Q&A. When I ask you questions, it would be great if you could put them in the chat. I hope that is okay for everybody. And with that, we'll make a start. So the teaching of writing, as I say, it's very, very linked to the teaching of reading. And what I'd like you to do is I'm going to give you a few statements, and I would just like you for each statement to use the chat function to say whether you agree or disagree, or you kind of agree or really, really strongly agree. Okay. So welcome to you all, including those that I can see are still joining actually. So first statement, writing in a second language is always difficult. If you think that's true, put it in the chat. If you think it's always difficult. Writing in class is a waste of time. It can be done at home. You may want to put a number. So you may want to put 1, agree, or 2, disagree, or something like that, because otherwise I won't quite know which one you're answering. That's great, but not always. Yes, yes, yes. Okay. Writing is a key way of practicing grammar, I can see lots of people disagreeing with number 2. And number 4, writing, like any other skill, needs a lot of practice. And the last one, writing requires a clear readership to be established. Okay, I'm going to talk through some of my feelings about these. Writing in an L2 is always difficult. Yes, I think I'm going to say I personally agree with that, but that may be because I don't speak any L2 to sufficient proficiency level. I speak some Spanish, but I would say writing in Spanish is still difficult for me in any form of formal context, because I have that feeling of accuracy, expected accuracy, and I know my Spanish is not always going to be accurate. So I do find writing difficult where there's an expectation of accuracy. If I'm just messaging a friend on WhatsApp, I know that that friend probably isn't going to judge me on the accuracy so much, so it's a little bit less so. But typically, I find writing difficult in an L2. Writing in class is a waste of time. It can be done at home. Now, I saw a lot of people disagreeing with this in the chat, and I can just see Mehdi has put in strongly disagree. I disagree as well. I think writing in class can be a good use of time. I think it can be a good use of time. For a start, it can be collaborative, so we can get students working together in pairs or small groups to create a text, which can be useful in itself to build class dynamics, to create discussion, and to have stronger learners perhaps modeling how to write for weaker learners. So I think that is a particularly useful aspect of writing in class. The other thing about writing in class that I find useful is that the teacher can give absolutely direct, immediate feedback. So I was doing it just now. Before I came in to do this talk, I was with a class just downstairs. I'm at work at the moment, just downstairs in a classroom. And as students were writing, I was able to sort of say, no, look at the verb, look at the noun, look at the verb. You need to get the agreement, noun, verb agreement, come on. And I was able to sort of give correction almost as they were writing, which I think is very useful. Writing is a way of practicing grammar. Yes, I think writing is often used as a way of practicing grammar, but we must remember that writing is also a skill in its own right. I don't think a communication skill in its own right. I don't think writing should be only used to practice grammar. Writing, like any other skill, needs lots of practice. I definitely agree with that. I think any skill requires practice, and the more, if you want to get good at writing, you probably need to write quite a lot. You also probably need feedback on that writing. Writing requires a clear readership to be established. I agree with that as well, particularly when we're thinking about writing as an act of communication, as opposed to an act of practicing a particular grammar point, for example. Okay, let's move on. So a few things about writing then. So the first thing to say about writing is it's not speech. It's not the same as speech. It's not a representation of speech written down. If you look at the way we speak, we don't always talk in sentences or even clauses. We use what Martin Bygate sometimes refers to as satellite units, which may just be a prepositional phrase, for example. So you might say, where is she? Well, that's a sentence, where is she? But the answer might well be in the office, in the office. Preposition, noun phrase, not a sentence. So we don't speak in sentences, but we tend to write most communication. When I'm talking about writing here, I'm thinking about more typical writing activities. Obviously, there's a blend. If we start thinking about writing a text message or WhatsApp message, then there may be features of speech within that, of spoken language within that. But typical writing follows clauses, sentences, and so on. Writing does not happen in a vacuum. It's socially embedded. So this goes back to what we had on the last slide about writers need to know there is a readership. Writers need to know there's a readership. Sorry, I can see a couple of people saying that there's a problem with the sound. I'm sorry, I don't think I can do anything about that at the moment. I don't know if any of my colleagues can do anything about it. The sound is clear. Okay, thank you. So hopefully for most of you, it's good. So writing doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's socially embedded. This goes back to the idea of needing a readership. We need to know who we're writing for. And while no two events are identical, there are many overlaps and therefore typical responses in terms of content and style. The sort of thing I'm thinking about here is if we were to compare people's CVs, for example, their resumes, their curriculum vitae, resume in some versions of English, some types of English. While they wouldn't all be identical, we'd probably see very common features of layout, of what is included, what isn't included, the sort of grammar that's used, the grammar patterns that are used, the degree of formality that's used. And this is where we start to move towards the idea of there being written genres where certain types of writing are created following particular patterns or fairly predictable patterns. Okay. Writing is both a noun and a verb. So a noun as in her writing is excellent, and a verb, I'm writing an email. And this is an important point because writing is both a product and a process. What I mean by that is when we're working with our learners, we could see writing simply as the thing they produce. So they go away or they work in class on their own, they produce a piece of writing and we look at that piece of writing, the finished thing. But writing is also a process. Writing doesn't just appear on a page. We have, not when it's produced by human beings at least. We have to go through a process of creating it. And writing, as I've said, is very much a communicative skill, but it does often get subsumed into grammar practice. So I think in some classrooms around the world, writing is used in class often to practice a particular grammar pattern, as opposed to writing as a communicative skill, a skill in its own right. So those are a few things maybe for us to keep in mind as we go through the talk. So what does writing involve? Okay, what does writing involve? A writer has to. Now, I've got about 5 or 6 ends to that sentence on the next little bit. You're going to see a writer has to, but you might like to put into the chat what a writer has to do, because my list, I think it becomes easier when we include the grammar to the writing task. Punctuation, yes, Saha, punctuation. Plan what the writer's going to write, absolutely, yes, planning. Grammar, take care of the grammar. Grammar, yes, grammar's important, isn't it? Be creative, have a draft, right, good. Spelling, clarity, good, good, good. Okay, fantastic. I'm going to show you, not mine. I can't say they're all mine because actually I took these from Scott Thornbury. But a writer has to produce grammatically accurate sentences. This is absolutely fundamental to generally what we consider good writing. Grammatically accurate sentences. Connect and punctuate these sentences. And a few people I saw put punctuation, and I can see Selma's just put cohesion. So that would be about connecting text, having a knowledge of discourse, connect, punctuate. So that connection is about creating a piece of discourse, a text that flows. Select and maintain an appropriate style. So that may refer, for example, to formality. Do we want a neutral style, an academic style, a formal style? Signal the direction that the message is taking. So again, this goes back to creating a piece of discourse. This goes back to using connecting words to signal to the writer, to the reader, I beg your pardon, to the reader, where the text is going. And very, very importantly, we have to know what the reader, who the reader is, in order to be able to judge what information they need, how much assumed knowledge there is. Do you assume that your reader knows about some of what you're writing about already, or do you have to explain everything? So you have to anticipate the reader's likely questions In other words, also their state of knowledge, their current knowledge, so as to be able to structure the message accordingly. Okay, I can see other great ideas coming into the chat as well. Somebody said we may need to persuade people. Yeah, in many, many types of writing, we're going to need to persuade the reader. Maybe not all types of writing, but in many types of writing, we're going to need to do that. Okay, so writing involves a lot of things. And like we said about reading, therefore, last week, we said reading isn't a single skill. Reading is made up of all sorts of different things: vocabulary knowledge, discourse knowledge, grammar knowledge, lexical knowledge, all sorts of stuff we have to be able to do. Writing is the same. We need lexical knowledge, we need grammar knowledge, we need discourse knowledge, we need knowledge of our readers and therefore what they expect. So writing isn't just a single thing. Again, like other sort of what we call skills in language teaching, it's made up of sub-skills and a lot of different sub-skills. Okay, so the next question: what are the main difficulties encountered when teaching writing in your context? So in your context, I mean your learning and teaching context. And we're going to look at different ways of approaching writing in the next few slides. I can see someone saying lack of vocabulary. Students translate from L1. Poor grammar, poor spelling. Generating ideas is an interesting one. Language level. Okay, lack of ideas. The levels of the students, lack of ideas. Okay, this thing that you're coming up with, a lot of things, people saying lack of ideas, people not knowing what to write about. Obviously, if you're faced with a blank screen or a blank piece of paper, it can be quite anxiety inducing, I think. People get sort of worried about, well, what am I going to fill for this? So what could we do, for example, to produce some ideas? Well, there are obviously things we could do to generate ideas. We could, for example, start with brainstorming. As a class, we could get students to suggest ideas to a particular problem, what we want to write about, so that we have bullet point sort of idea of content before we start. That may help with the lack of ideas, for example. I can see a few people saying things like, well, you know, my students don't really want to do it. It's not very motivating for them. And yes, I can see that if you are producing a text that you don't think anybody is really going to read, then it's not the most motivating thing to do. Even if you think it's only your teacher that's going to read it, it may not be that motivating. And I can see Omar's just put a lack of passion to write. So people don't really want to do it. So we need to then think, well, can we maybe produce some writing tasks that people may find quite interesting to do? I can see other people saying, look, my learners tend to translate from their L1. They think of what they want to say in their L1 and then try to translate it into English, for example. Good points. Okay. There are different ways in which we can approach the business of writing, different ways in which people have taught writing in the past. One is usually referred to as a product approach. And I suspect you're going to be familiar with a product approach when I explain it to you. So first of all, learners are familiarized. They're taught grammar and or vocabulary. So learners are taught something specifically. Then there may be a controlled writing phase, creating sentences and manipulating structures. So you can see here that the first couple of stages of this are actually really more about mastering grammar and using writing as a means to enforce grammar, reinforce grammar, rather than writing for a communicative purpose. And then guided writing, learners write beyond the sentence, often following a model template. So we sort of build up from smaller bits, grammar and vocabulary, to sentences, controlling sentences, maybe joining sentences, and only then do we get to text level. Okay, So that's a product approach. But probably one of the most prevailing current ways in which teachers go about teaching writing, and indeed course materials go about teaching writing, is through what's called a genre approach. And in a genre approach, learners study texts of a particular genre, and then they look at the paragraph structure and relevant vocabulary, rhetorical devices, before they produce their own text. So let me just give you an example of that. If we were teaching our learners to write an email of complaint, something's happened, maybe they bought something online and it comes to them and it's not what they expected, they want to complain about it. One way of doing that, to teach them to write that form, would be to show them a model email of complaint and analyze it with them. So the teacher becomes a sort of discourse analysis. The teacher conducts a sort of discourse analysis on it. So you might look at, well, notice the greeting, notice how it starts and the formality, but then look at the paragraph 1. What is paragraph 1 used to do? Paragraph 1 for a letter of email of complaint might be about establishing what happened. So I bought this product from you and this has happened or that has happened. So you establish what the first paragraph is for. You might then establish in the second paragraph why it's a problem for you, why is it causing you anxiety, why are you bothering to write? And then in the next paragraph you might write something about what you want done about it, what you expect them to do about it, how you expect to be helped. Okay, so that would be a genre approach. We look at a model, we analyze that model, and the analysis is important. We may look at individual features of grammar and vocabulary if we think they're useful, but we also try to get the text level grammar, if you like, the structure in place. You could almost present it to learners like a sort of flow diagram sort of thing. You know, you start here and the next bit and the next bit. I can see Magdi's put introduce the topic, main body, paragraph, conclusion. Yeah, so you then analyze the text so that students can see what's expected, and then they produce their own text, which is similar to the one they read and analyzed, but obviously not the same. Okay. Good. So that's a genre approach. Now, there are certain advantages to a genre approach. These are taken from Ken Hyland's work. For those of you that want to know more about writing and research into writing, Ken Hyland wrote a book, I think it's called Teaching and Researching Writing, in 2016. I think that's the second or third edition of the book in 2016. So if you're interested, try and get hold of that book. But there are advantages to using a genre-based approach. So Hyland says, well, first of all, it's pretty explicit. It makes the learning goal very clear. So, you know, you'll tell the learners at the beginning of the lesson, you're going to learn to write a letter of complaint, an email of complaint. So the goal is clear, it's explicit. It's systematic. So there's a coherent framework for both language and context. You can actually set out a syllabus, a writing syllabus based on different genres. It's needs-based, so in the sense that you would try to predict the genres that your learners are going to need and going to use. What genres do your learners need and want to use? Now, that may be more difficult the younger age groups you teach, because it may be very, very difficult to predict a genre that your primary school students or secondary school students will need to use in the future. It's supportive, so teachers support learning and creativity. They do this through monitoring, through giving feedback on drafts and that sort of thing. It's critical, according to Hyland. Learners can challenge the patterns and compare and contrast. We'll get to the next slide in a moment. I might question Hyland on that to some extent. And consciousness raising teaches and learners become more aware of the genres as they teach them and as they learn about them. Can you think of any disadvantage to the genre approach? Well, I can, and that's it. I think if you're not careful, it might be seen as imposing models and ways of doing things on learners from a very Western cultural perspective, and I think that's not right. Now, Hyland says we can critique that, right? We can problematize that when we teach and say, but just because people do that, write like that in the UK or in the US, doesn't mean you have to write like that. So we could problematize it to an extent. Let me just give you an example of this. As I said, I was teaching just before I started this webinar. I was teaching a group, and the writing activity we were looking at was writing CVs and how to write a CV, curriculum vitae, a resume. And it was really pushing people to write in a way that was very, well, appropriate for the UK and probably, I imagine, the US, but I don't know about any other places. So it was very sort of trying to get people to conform to a particular way of doing things, which I personally find problematic. I can see some great things. Daly was saying, yeah, people may only end up trying to recreate the text and it lacks creativity. I think that's really true. That's a great point. One of the problems with the genre approach is it does seem to stifle creativity a little bit, for example. Okay, let's move on. I'm aware of time. I can see one or two things being put in the chat that are questions. It's quite hard for me to catch up with all the questions when they're in the chat, but you can use the Q&A and we'll leave some time. So if there's something you particularly want me to address that I haven't, please feel free to use the Q&A. I did see earlier that somebody said, what's the difference between a controlled writing activity and I think practice writing activity? And there's probably not much, to be honest, difference between them. Sometimes people use just different terms for more or less the same thing. Okay, so we've looked at a product-based approach. We've looked at a genre approach. We're going to also look at a process approach to writing. Now, a process approach to writing is, again, something which is really quite, I think, quite common in most teaching materials. And I should stress that a process approach and a genre approach are not mutually exclusive. It would be more than possible to blend them and combine them. So a process approach, what does it involve? Well, can you think of potential stages of a process approach to the teaching of writing? We've already had some, to be honest. Earlier on, when you were telling me about difficulties, you were saying things like, a lot of people said, well, lack of ideas is a problem. Lack of ideas, lack of grammar is a problem. Grammar mistakes. I think someone said spelling mistakes is a problem. Yes. And Amani, I'm sorry if my pronunciation of your names is horrible. I really am. Amani has just said brainstorming would be something you would do in a process approach. Absolutely. It would be. Brainstorming, drafting, revising, editing, publishing. Fantastic, Mohammed. Yes, I can stop talking now. We'll just take Mohammed's answer to that. Preparation, first draft, revising, final product. Pre-writing, generating ideas, drafting, editing. Fantastic ideas. Okay, so here are some that we put into a book that I wrote with Scott. If those of you that were listening to Scott last week, in a book Scott and I did with Sandy Millen. Imagine writing a teaching blog post. Writing a blog post about a particular teaching context with which you are familiar. Put the stages below in the order in which you would do them. And are there any things here you wouldn't do? So there's the 5 stages. You may want to just try putting them into an order. Order you're probably working towards. E is first. Fantastic, Ranim. E is first. Yes, someone's got it. Mohammed's got it. They just basically, to make it easy, I put everything in reverse order. Consult books, get ideas. So that idea of generate ideas, have something to write about. Then organize your ideas. So which ideas sort of belong together, relate to each other. Write a rough draft. Read and make changes and corrections. Read, make changes, corrections. So editing your work. And then from there, write the final copy. So the intended order that I had was E, D, C, B, A, which I can see everyone's getting. Fantastic. I think I saw a comment just now in the text, in the chat, that said about this is for advanced students, or this may only work for advanced students. Yes, once we get to sort of text level writing, it may work, it's going to work better with advanced students, definitely. Or at least students must be ready to write a text level. And obviously they cannot write at text level before they can write at sentence level. So they have to write at sentence level before they can go on to joining those sentences together. So that was a good point, very good point. Okay, there are other things you could include in a process approach. So this is more or less the same. Select the topic, brainstorming, note-taking, etc., composing, revising. Then we've got in this version response to revision. So you might specifically ask students to look at the feedback they've received, and proofreading and editing, again, tidying it up. And then evaluation, which is usually done by the teacher, but you could possibly have peer review as well. And in exam classes, peer review, peer evaluation can be really useful, because you would expect students to use the criteria of the exam to evaluate their writing, the writing of their peer, which means they have to then familiarize themselves with the exam marking criteria, which is almost bound to be useful. Okay. I'm now going to show you some activities, okay? I'm just going to show you 6 activities. And in a moment, we'll discuss them. I'm not saying these activities are particularly good or particularly bad. They're just different styles, different types of activity, okay? Okay, first one, learners are given 5 sentences, each containing, for example, the second conditional. However, the words for each sentence are jumbled and the learners have to put them into the correct order. And you can see you've got an example there, okay? So that's the first activity. You can see that it's very much this idea, related to grammar. Someone's just put in the chat, this is writing related to grammar. Yeah, absolutely. It's not writing for a communicative purpose. It's not writing for a communicative purpose. It's writing to practice a grammar point. Now that can be useful. That can be useful. I'm not saying it's not useful, because when we write, we have a little bit more time to think. We have a bit more time to think than when we speak. That's one of the big differences between speech and writing. So if you want people to apply a grammar rule, then giving them some time to do it might be very useful. But yes, this is writing to practice a grammar point. And for those of you that were talking about, yes, if I had £1 million, I would buy a car. Great. Very good. You can see those of you who were talking about level earlier and what would work. This will work for any level, really. It's just obviously not with the second conditional, but the activity type you could use with more or less beginners. You know, how are you could be jumbled up and the students have to get how are you in the correct order. So, yeah, you could, it will work in principle for just about any level. Let's go on to a second activity. The teacher sets up a class blog that all learners can access and write about their interests and get reaction from their colleagues. So we set up a document, maybe a Google Doc or something like that, that everyone can access. everyone can write on, and students can respond to what other people are saying. Yes, somebody just put in the chat, free writing, Mohammed, I think. It's creative, yes. And we can use a Padlet. Yes, Padlet would be fine. And you get peer correction. It's personalized. And this, unlike the first activity, is very much, Ranim's just said, communicative. Yes, it is communicative. Unlike that first activity, which was about can you manipulate the words to form a grammar pattern, this can be done. This is about communication. Somebody said it's done outside class time. This can be done outside class time. It absolutely can. It can, if you are lucky enough to work in an institution where there's a suite of computers, for example, it could be done during class time with the teacher commenting and co-creating and supporting as the learners type virtually. So that would be an opportunity. Do teachers have time to react to a class blog if they have 4 classes? That's a fantastic point. I'm imagining that it wasn't really a question. Do they have time? Probably say they don't have time to respond, which I absolutely understand. It may be that it will only work in certain institutions, certain contexts. One thing I guess you could do is set it up more like a Twitter account sort of thing, where, or X, whatever it's called now, where learners can only write a certain number of words or characters, which would make it far more manageable for teachers. And you could encourage learners to respond much more to each other's messages. And perhaps if you are lucky enough to have any class time, use class time to review the document in class time, which would try to make it a little bit easier for the teachers from a point of view of time. So we've looked at a couple of activities. Let's have a look at another one. Learners write a short dialogue. So the writing comes in a short dialogue and then perform it for the class. Alternatively, the learners could produce a short narrative based on a particular genre, picture prompts, or a set of vocabulary or whatever. So learners write together a short dialogue or a short text, and then they perform it for the class. Okay, the activity's okay, I think. You can use the writing to practice a particular set of vocabulary, a particular function, a particular grammar point, if that's what you want to do. However, and you could argue that this is reasonably communicative in that it will be performed and therefore people will hear what you've written and understand what you've written. On the other hand, not many of us are ever going to have to write dialogue. So it's not something learners are likely to have to do outside of class. People who do have to write dialogue are probably not going to be doing it in a second language all that often. And dialogue, if it's spoken language, then the features of spoken language won't be all that much like typical written language. So we just need to be aware what we're asking learners to do. But it can be a reasonably motivating idea. Nof says, I think a dialogue needs a template. Yeah, you could model it. You could give a model dialogue and then ask students to change particular details of it, or write a similar one on a related topic or something like that. Yet Mehdi has put it could be more guided. You can give as much or as little guidance, I think, as you want, depending on how creative you want your learners to be. Okay, let's move on, because I am just aware of time and I really want to leave time for your questions at the end. Okay, the teacher asks the learners some standard comprehension type questions. So at this point, I need to be clear. The students haven't read anything. They're not trying to find correct answers. So the teacher asks the learners some standard comprehension type questions, such as, why did John leave home? Where did he go? Who did he meet? What did he start doing? How did he become so successful? Okay, then the learners must produce a text that answers those particular questions. So they say, John left home because, and he did this, and he did this, and he did this. So the learners produce a text that answers these questions. They work in groups, perhaps, first discussing what their story might be about, what it might include. So this brainstorming idea, and then the teacher puts the stories on the wall for others to read. So we have some time for students to look around and look at how other people address the question. This activity is quite flexible. Obviously, the students need to be able to write at text level to be able to do it. But depending on the questions you ask, it shouldn't be too difficult. You could model it so the students would predominantly need the present simple, for example, if you asked for them to create something about somebody's routine, for example, they would be using largely the present simple. You could obviously pre-teach vocabulary that you think might be needed if you want to give more guidance and more control. And Nova said that maybe it's a story without an ending and they have to write the ending. That's great, yes, but there are lots of writing activities we can do actually that feature that sort of thing. So you can have a common start but leave out the conclusion, or you could give guidance that one group has to produce a sad conclusion, like a tragic story, and the other group has to write a happy, nice conclusion. And how do they get to their end points, which could be a nice activity as well. Okay, I'm just trying to keep up with some of the comments as they come in. Okay. Well, let's go to another activity. A comic conclusion. I love the idea, a comic conclusion. Yes. All right. Are the following sentences correct? Well, you've got a few. You can have when did you bought that old car? How many persons were at the meeting? One, no. Yeah. No, one is grammatically not correct. This is like freeze frame. They complete the story. Yes. Great. Yes. Good. Yeah, good. So if we look at those 5 sentences, clearly what we're focusing now is writing at sentence level. And you're asking students to correct the sentences, essentially. Some of the ones I've put in are deliberately ambiguous in that they're not wrong. I think only 2 are absolutely probably wrong. I think 1 and 5 we'd have to say are wrong. But 3 probably wrong, but we don't know exactly what the learner's trying to express. Okay, so we're trying to get students to focus on correcting mistakes. All right, so again, a grammar focus to this. How could we make this activity, although a bit more engaging? Right, there are 2 ideas I've got for this. 1, we use sentences, so those sentences that you can see there, you take from student work, student homework, for example. So if the students do a bit of writing for homework, you collect some sentences from their homework, and this is a way of giving them feedback on their writing, which is relatively time friendly for a teacher. It's relatively time efficient to do that. So you could use students' own examples. The other thing you could do, and that I've done, is create a game around it. You know, students these days love games. We've always loved games, probably. And so what I might do is give students a budget that they get, I don't know, let's say $500. They've got $500 and 10 sentences. Some of the sentences are correct, some are wrong, and they have to buy correct sentences. And you set it up as an auction. So if the students working in groups have decided that sentence number 5 is correct, then they try and bid against each other to buy sentence 5 and so on. So you could try to gamify this sort of rather dull activity in a way that, you know, becomes a bit more fun, for example. Okay, I think we've got one more. Okay, the learners write a text on paper to a prompt. So they do a piece of writing. They work in pairs or in groups of 3 to do it. I quite often get students in class to write together, and what I do is tell them that they must keep changing the actual writer around, and the other 2 must keep talking to the writer, the person who's actually holding the pen. The other 2 have to tell that person what to write, correct things, tell them how to go on, almost dictate to them what to do. So the students work in pairs or 3s. The teacher circulates and supports, as you would expect. And then when they're finished, the groups stick the writing on the wall, and the learners circulate and write comments, including corrections, on each other's work. So there's peer feedback. I can see people putting in the chat. There's a lot of peer feedback. That's great. And there's a readership. I think the other thing is, if you tell students beforehand, look, in 20 minutes, we're going to put these up on the wall, and students are going to go around, you're going to read each other's text. That does at least create some sort of readership, some sort of reason for writing, some sort of outcome, if you like. And I must stress that third point there, the teacher circulates and supports, is absolutely vital, in my opinion. One of the big advantages, I've said this earlier and I'll repeat it, one of the big advantages to actually getting students to write physically in class, whether it's on a computer or whether it's on paper, one of the big advantages is that the teacher can give more or less real-time feedback when the student is actually engaged with the text, thinking about the text, and so on. Okay, let's go on. Okay, are there any activities you like? Are there any activities you could use with your own class? Which activities use writing in order to communicate? Those are the activities, but I'm just looking at the time, and you will know which ones you like. You will know if there's any that you think could be adapted for your own class, that might be useful for your own class. Remember, number 5, those things that are right or wrong, the sentence that are right or wrong, you could adapt to make it a bit more engaging for the students, rather than just question, sentences they've never seen before and don't mean anything to them. Okay. Okay, good. Let's move on. And we've got one more activity, okay? But we've got this as a sort of more of a materials writing. I want to sort of move to you as teachers and expert teachers, dedicated teachers. I'm sure what you sometimes do is find something in a course book, in course material, and think, oh, I don't know, can I make this better? And I think quite often we could make it better. So look at the following writing task and answer the questions. So write 6 sentences describing your favorite film. 6 sentences describing your favorite film. 1, how could you make this exercise more communicative? 2, how could you redesign it so that the learners produced a single unified text rather than just a list of sentences? How could you make it more authentic, more realistic? And how could you provide a readership? So you may just like to have a thought about some of those. I'm just going to have a sip of water, and then I will tell you my thoughts on that. Some great ideas coming in from the chat as well. They can be asked to write and compare. Readership means audience. Yeah. Class blog. Yes, you could do it as a class blog. You could use a model. So that sort of genre approach. Once you start going to models, moving towards a genre approach, I would certainly say, look, one of the problems with this activity, one of the problems, I think, is it doesn't encourage learners to write as a text. it says write 6 sentences about the film. Well, you know, if I wrote about my favorite film, you know, Casablanca was made in 1942. Casablanca stars Humphrey Bogart and Ingrid Bergman. Casablanca, it's not a text, it's just sentences. So we could get people to write, for example, a brief review of the thing. You know, if you go on IMDb, loads of people are reviewing movies all the time. It's something now that people actually do, isn't it? Writing a movie review is a genre that many people now do, even if it's informal on some sort of blog. If it's on some sort of public network, they comment on movies and talk about movies in a way that only film critics would probably have done 20 years ago. So we could create an audience by perhaps creating a blog, letting people read each other's reviews, moving, as I say, from sentence level to text level would definitely help. And you may do that through writing a review of the movie as opposed to just sentences about the movie. I think once you've got something that says write 6 sentences, it's very hard to get away from the idea that what you're actually practicing is grammar, because suddenly it's not a text, it's not very meaningful. Yeah, so Sarah has put, we can ask them to write a review and talk. Oh, no, it disappeared too quickly. But I think I got the idea that we could get students to talk about their favorite scene and bits of the movie, and we could guide them. All of these activities with your learners, particularly with the freer writing things, you can give as much or as little guidance as you feel appropriate for your class. Mahmood says gamifying the task by dividing them into writers and movie critics. Okay, yes. Peer discussion. They should respect others' choices. Yes, I agree. Everything in a classroom must be done with respect. I mean, it's perfectly fine, I think, to disagree with somebody's film choice. You know, if somebody said to me, I don't know, well, no, I'm not going to name it in case one of you really loves the movie, but, you know, I might disagree with people's choice of favorite movie. I'm sure people disagree with mine, but we must always do it respectfully. Absolutely. They can act their favorite scene with their friends. Well, that might involve a bit of dialogue writing as well. We could maybe get them to say, right, this happens in the scene. Now write the dialogue for it. Now perform it. That's great. Okay, I'm just going to keep moving on a little bit, I'm afraid. Corrective feedback. Okay. For all writing, I'm just going to be very blunt about this. I think corrective feedback is one of the most important things a teacher can do in helping learners become better writers. Corrective feedback is absolutely essential. And whereas in spoken language, when we're interacting with people, we may well get feedback that we failed to communicate, right? If I'm trying to speak Spanish in a restaurant and I say I need a table for 2, and the person in the restaurant doesn't understand me, I get feedback immediately that I failed. In writing, that doesn't always happen. You don't get that kind of feedback. So written feedback, feedback from the teacher, I think is absolutely essential. There is some research on it. So this is taken from Dana Ferris's work. Dana Ferris is terrific on feedback. She says corrective feedback can help learners revise texts and, crucially, carry over learning to new texts. So that is the crucial point now, that if you help a learner correct their text, it won't just help that text, it will help future texts as well. It's genuine learning. Focused corrective feedback is more effective than unfocused corrective feedback. What that means is that it's too much for learners if you more or less just point out just every mistake. You just say, look, wrong, go away and correct it. It's too much and probably very demotivating. What is better is if you can pick out a few quite big things that the learner can work on. Work with the big things first. Maybe more than one example of it. There may be several examples you can point out, but you say, look, you've got to get this difference between noun and verb, right? The difference between produce and product. Significance, word classes. You may want to focus on certain things. Focused corrective feedback is more effective, according to research, than unfocused corrective feedback. Indirect corrective feedback may be more effective, What this means, indirect, means that the teacher doesn't actually correct the mistake. What they do is indicate that a mistake is present, and then the learner has to supply the correct version of it. Go away and correct it. But indirect corrective feedback may be more effective, but explanation helps. So they almost need to involve a dialogue with the teacher. Like, well, think, do you need a noun or a verb? Do you need a noun or a verb? Well, what is the noun form or what's the verb form? But that is very time consuming for a teacher. That is time consuming, and not all teachers may have time to do that. But vitally, learners must be pushed to engage with corrective feedback. So somehow, if in a typical sort of situation, students give us a piece of homework that they've written at home and we correct it, when we give it back to them, it's no good if they just put it in their bag and walk away. We need to push them to actually look at the feedback and think what it means and go through the process of correcting errors. Aniba puts, immediate feedback is constructive and saves time. Yeah, Aniba, I could not agree more with you. I love being able to correct things immediately, but it tends to mean doing it in class time, which in some cases may not be possible. Oh, Sophia says we can start by mentioning the points we like. Yes, no, Sophia, that is a really good point, and that's not on my slide. I didn't mean it to, well, Dana Ferris's work is on corrective feedback, but you're absolutely right. We also ought to be encouraging. We also ought to say what is good. And I think we should also respond to it as a piece of communication. So if it's a movie review, then maybe what you do is say, oh, I like the sound of this movie. This movie sounds really exciting. So try to communicate something give feedback as a piece of communication, as well as just an exercise in getting grammar right. And that is, thank you for pointing that out, whoever did, because, what I've summarized from Dana Ferris there is about correction. And actually, we also need to be encouraging, and we need to respond as a piece of communication. Okay. I'm sure if you've got more questions about feedback, you can put them in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to that in 10 minutes or so. So there's a bit of time to answer questions. Correction codes can save time. Yes, they can. Yes, they can. Although that really then means somebody's got to check that the learner did get it right, that they did use the code and get it right. Okay, we will skip that bit. Okay, assumed knowledge. I'm going to show you a text. And what I'd like you to look at is what knowledge does the writer assume the recipient has? So, a lot of writing, and a problem with writing, the problem with writing is that, or difficulty with writing, not a problem, a difficulty, is you have to make a judgment about how much knowledge your reader has. What do they already know and what don't they know? Now, I'm going to show you a text. I have to say the text is old. I make no apology. The text is old. It's actually a postcard. And postcards are really useful in the sense that they're a text, but a very short one, which makes them useful for teaching purposes. This is a more or less authentic text. It's slightly, I adapted it slightly. I took one line out. It's more or less an authentic text. But I was talking to my class yesterday, and I said, when did you last send a postcard? And some of the class had never sent a postcard in their lives, which I haven't sent a postcard for probably about 15 years to anybody. Some people had sent a postcard somewhere around 2007, 2008. It's an old-fashioned text type. I do get that. I understand that. But as I said, it's got a certain use for pedagogic purpose because it's a text, but short. I'm guessing you know what postcards are, right? That they're not so out of date that it's like, what on earth is a postcard? You know, they still get sold in the UK. They still get sold, but no one sends them. I think they just get sold now as souvenirs, like, look at this nice building I was looking at. So there's the text. Now, so I did that to make it look a little bit like a postcard, but I'm going to show you the text on a bigger slide so it's easier to read. I haven't changed the text, but that is the text that the students have actually got. So what I'd like you to do is think first of all about, well, what shared information does this author, does the writer of this postcard assume? What does she assume the receiver of the postcard knew and understood? The location, Iman says the location, we arrived late. It doesn't say where you arrived late. So yes, assume that the location is shared. You might look at we arrived late. Who does we refer to? It's a pronoun. Now, normally we say pronouns refer to nouns, but there's no noun that it obviously refers to. So it's shared, assumed knowledge that the reader knows who we refers to. We arrived late on Friday. Assuming late. Now the holiday's in full swing, and it's hell, I can tell you. There's nothing to do but lie in the sun and occasionally take a dip in the pool, or the sea if you prefer. If I ever manage to empty my glass, a waiter pounces from nowhere and refills it, and I have to empty it all over again. Still, I suppose we'll survive. Miss you loads, wish you were here. Okay. So there is assumed knowledge in terms of who's going on holiday, where they're going. There is also assumed understanding of what a good holiday might be like. So although this person says it's hell, obviously she doesn't mean that. She means she was having a great time, lying in the sun, having a drink, swimming in the sea, having a nice time. Okay, so there's an assumed cultural knowledge or expectation that we share the same ideas about what makes something good. Okay, now what I'd like you to do, keep that text in mind if you can. Keep that text in mind and think, if you were a teacher, how could you exploit that text? How could you exploit that text for a genre approach to writing, a genre approach? Or if you prefer, how could you use the text to support a process approach to writing? All right, so there's your text. How could you use that to support a genre approach, or indeed a process approach? Okay, a genre approach or a process approach. You've got a few seconds to think about it, and then I will talk as well. Yeah, Asma, yes, Asma, it could be used for both. It could be used for both. The process approach for expressions, yeah, so look, we'll start with the process approach, right? Okay, we would probably need to decide a location and show a photograph of it, because all postcards, just about all postcards, I think, have a picture. So we need to show the students the picture and then say, right, imagine you are in this place. Imagine you're in this place. What sort of things have you been doing? What would be nice? If you want to make your friend envious, what would you tell them you've been doing? So we try to get ideas for it. We might then, as a process approach, get people to write the postcard, and then of course read the postcard, perhaps get feedback on that postcard, on what they've written, and rewrite it so that it's accurate. Okay, So you would go through those stages of brainstorming ideas, getting ideas, writing a draft, editing, writing a second version. For a genre approach, postcards lend themselves really, really well to a genre approach, for demonstrating a genre approach. If only people still wrote postcards, it would be a good lesson. Obviously, it's not a great lesson if people don't write postcards, but they have got a very generic thing, okay? Start by describing the journey or the place, all right? So you start by saying, we've arrived, the weather's beautiful, there were delays or whatever. You start by describing the place or the journey. Then you describe some of the things you've been doing. Yesterday, we went on a trip too. Today, we've gone this, all right? In this case, she talks about lying in the sun or swimming in the sea, having a drink. You describe some of the things you do. And then the third bit, you say, but I'm looking forward to seeing you. I'm sort of looking forward to coming home and seeing you. In this case, she's put miss you loads and wish you were here. Wish you were here was a very formulaic expression for ending postcards. So can you see from that short text, the teacher with the class could identify 3 distinct stages, 3 clear stages, and say to the students, follow those stages, right? Start by doing 1, do 2, do 3. So that would be a genre approach. We have a text, we analyze it, and we go through then asking the students, obviously after they've analyzed it and going through the 3 stages, give them another destination and ask them to write a postcard so that they end up creating the text, of course. So that would be a genre approach. For genre approach, also change the postcard into an email. Yeah, into an email or a WhatsApp message, or, you know, because I said to my class, you know, what do we do now? Well, obviously, what we do is we take a picture on our phones and then WhatsApp to people that we want to make jealous, I suppose, that we want to say, oh, look at me having a great time. So yes, we could change it to be more like a modern day thing. But yes, the idea is that we study this from a genre approach, that we could look at that text, analyze it, and identify stages in it. Okay. Okay, we are going to, there is a little reflection task for you to do, but I think we'll skip it because I'd rather get to the Q&A. I will leave it on the screen there in case you want to do it. So a reflection task, write 5 sentences that give advice on how to teach writing. Each sentence should use one of the words below. So if you want to do that, you could write advice on collaboration, audience correction, draft communication, if you want to, but you don't have to. I think I've spoken for long enough. I've spoken for about an hour and 45, well, over an hour and 15 minutes nearly. You must be sick of listening to me. So what I'm going to do is go to the Q&A, and if there are questions in the Q&A, which I haven't clicked on yet, I will do my best to answer them. I can't promise I can answer them all because I don't know what you've asked, but we'll see. Okay, thank you very much for listening and participating. All of those who were typing into the text, thank you very, very, very much for doing it. I'm sorry I can't read out all of your contributions because obviously they just come in too quickly. But thank you very much for listening. Okay, I can see some questions coming in. How to help dyslexic students in reading and writing. You know, it really, I don't know who asked, Niveen asked, again, apologies so much if my pronunciation of your names is not nice. How to help dyslexic students. It really is very difficult. There are 1 or 2 things that you can do, particularly with reading. There are things we can do. For writing, it may well be about, for example, getting students to, even in their first language. You know, I know somebody in my family is dyslexic, even in their own language, getting them to use tools that will check for basic spelling and things like that may help. So there are lots, now we're all writing online, it is relatively easy to get text checked. So it may be about giving people strategies as far as is possible. I can see there are a couple about dyslexia, so I'm pleased, to pick up on that if that's a few things. How can we teach writing more effectively so that students get fully involved in the process? Yeah, I think having a readership is really, really important. Having a readership is really important. I think perhaps using technology as well. If you are lucky enough to work in an institution where people can use computers, share documents, create text jointly, co-construct texts, can be very, very motivating for students, can be very motivating. How can we counter the problem of students using AI to write their essays? Believe me, I work at a university and every university in the UK is asking the same question. I think there are things we can do that make using AI more problematic at the moment. For example, if you ask people to reflect on their own personal experiences, it's hard for AI to pick up on that without being told what those personal experiences are. But of course, AI is only going to get better and better and better, so it will be more difficult. The only real way, I guess, you can do it is to move to doing more writing in class, but that may not be optimal. That may not be great because of the time it takes. Why is it that numerous learners can speak better than they write? That's an interesting question. I hadn't thought about that. I'm guessing they can write, they can speak better. It may come down to opportunities. Maybe your learners are getting more opportunities to speak outside the classroom. And because we said at the very beginning that to learn to speak or to write, like any other skill, requires practice and lots of time to do it. So it's just possible that your learners are getting more opportunities outside class, perhaps, to speak than to write. That might be one explanation. Is a genre approach appropriate for any level? That's a good question. I'm going to say no. I think I'm just going to say no to that, because I think for a genre, a genre implies a text. You can't really have a genre at sentence level. So your learners need to be in a position where they can combine sentences to make a text. A genre approach isn't appropriate if the learners are still beginner level and trying to write at sentence level. I think for writing, we have to accept that we're going to go from sentence level writing to text level writing. So a genre approach assumes text level writing. Okay, let me go on down. How can I improve my writing skills as a teacher? Well, that is a fantastic question. And I really am impressed that you want to. So obviously, one way of doing it, you need to be able to write a lot. So the more writing you do, and you could use AI to correct it. If you're worried that you're making sort of grammatical mistakes or something like that, then AI will be able to correct them and highlight them for you. If you don't want AI to actually correct it, you could ask AI to underline it for you or indicate it in some way. And then you try to correct it just as you would do for your learners' homework. So that might work. The other thing that you could do, a bit like looking for speaking practice opportunities, is sort of contribute to forums and stuff and type into there and practice your writing. But it depends, I guess, what sort of writing you're trying to improve. If you're trying to improve sort of academic writing with a view to publishing work, then that might require something else. But the idea that you write a bit and have feedback on it would work. how to avoid the problems of the genre approach. Yeah, now I think the main problem with a genre approach is this push to make people to conform, that people end up having to do things in a sort of standardized way, sometimes losing their own voice completely in doing so. I think what you need to do is maybe highlight the genre in a contrastive way. So in a genre approach, like I was doing with the postcard, I know the postcard's not a great example because of the age. I used it because it's a short text that's easy to analyze. But in a genre approach, you can say, look, this is the steps that this text goes through. Now, what would we do in our culture? What would you do in your culture? How would it look different? And if it would look different, then which voice do you want to develop? And there's nothing wrong with keeping your own identity that you already have. You don't necessarily need to create another identity. Is copying words and sentences to lower grades important? Can it help them? Yes, I would say yes. In fact, at very, very low level, at very low levels, when kids are beginning to learn English, I think copying words and then start with words and progress to sentences, I think it is bound to help them. And depending on what language they speak as their first language, whether they can already write in their first language, the degree of support and help they need may vary depending on how much help and support do they need. How can we apply all these steps in a 60-minute session with a class of 60 students? You cannot probably do all of these steps in class. Let me give you a few things I think you could do with 60 students in a class. I think you could get them to do group writing, but you would need to monitor very carefully and quickly, like not leaving groups alone, but you may be able to use some group writing. You could certainly go through the stages of a process approach to writing, like brainstorming ideas, getting a few ideas and asking students to put them into words, into say a paragraph. You may be able to display some of those paragraphs. It may depend a little bit on what equipment you have available to you. And I'm very aware that I work at a university in the UK, so I'm privileged in that, we have equipment in the classrooms that allows us to do certain things. We have something where I can put a piece of paper on the desk and it be put up onto a screen in the classroom, which means we can all comment on students' work. So students can write for 5 minutes, and then I can take some writing from some students and display it on a screen. And then we can go through the process of correction. So there may be a few things that you can do like that. But I appreciate, 60 minutes isn't long. A class of 60 students is always going to be difficult to manage. A genre approach should be able, you can use a genre approach where you're analyzing texts. That could be done as a whole class activity, even with 60 students, even if it becomes a bit like a lecture from you. You could use a genre approach with a big class. That I think would be true. There's a question, I think inevitably we're going to get lots of questions about AI. Fatima's put, in the era of artificial intelligence, how can educators effectively encourage students to refrain from using AI tools during writing assignments and examinations? As I say, this is something I think all of us are grappling with. And one sort of question a step back from that is, given that AI is not going to disappear, should we be trying to stop students using AI tools? Or should we be teaching students to use AI tools ethically and in an intelligent way? But clearly, if you are assessing someone's written English and they haven't written it, that is problematic. As I say, you may be able to design tasks that are personalized in such a way that AI would not be able to do it very well. But you would have to design the task which is highly personalized in order to be able to do that. Will you tell me the sentence of if in activity 1? I can't remember it, Layla. I think it was something like, if I had £1 million, I would buy a new car. If I had £1 million, I'd buy a new car, I think. But I can't remember exactly. If anyone can remember, it's probably in the recording somewhere. No, that's a great question. Someone's put a question. Why should we include collaborative writing activities when in real life we write individually? That is a fantastic question. The best answers I can give you for this. First of all, I would question perhaps in this day and age whether all writing is individual. With Google Docs and so on, it's easier to collaborate. And I know some of the work documents I have to produce, they are collaborative. However, that may not be true for everybody. So what I would answer is that in class, writing can be slow and boring and learners turn off. If they work collaboratively, there is also a chance to speak and share ideas and be creative and co-create ideas. So somebody put in the chat earlier on that it was very, very difficult for students necessarily to think of ideas. So giving students a chance to co-create and work with other people might be really useful from an engagement point of view. And then my other argument for it would be weak writers, if they're working in a group with a stronger writer, even if all they really do is watch that writer write and read what they write, may well be beneficial to them. So they may learn from each other. But I absolutely take your point, and it's a great point, that it's not a particularly, for many learners, it won't be a particularly authentic thing to do. I'm aware that we've only got like 4 minutes, so I'm sort of, there are still loads of questions. I'm so sorry, I'm just not going to be able to get to them all, I don't think. Can we tell stories? Can we tell students a story and ask them to write another story that has the same beginning? Yes, look, writing is a creative activity, and you can set your learners as much creative sort of writing as you wish to do. There is a lovely writing activity in, I think it's Jack Richard's book, Interchange, and it's probably the intermediate version of Interchange, where the students have a 3-paragraph story, okay? The first paragraph is the same. The first paragraph in each story is the same. And it's like, this person had fantastic skills at doing this. He was really clever. He had this, he had this, he had money or something or other. I can't remember. And then they get given the last paragraph. The last paragraph, one is he's ended up in prison, and one is he's ended up as a millionaire. Okay, so one group has the millionaire story, one group the prison story, and they have to write the middle paragraph explaining how he either ended up a millionaire or he ended up in prison. And then, of course, they share their stories and tell their stories and so on. Somebody's put, what is readership? Sorry, I should have explained that. Readership is that somebody reads your work, not just to correct it, but like in real life. You know, if I write an email to somebody, I know who I'm sending it to, and I create it for that person, making judgments about what that person already knows. That person is my readership. In lessons, it helps, if you believe in communicative language teaching at least, that the piece of writing will be read by somebody as a piece of communication, not just as an exercise in correcting grammar mistakes, which somebody very rightly, when I was talking about corrective feedback, somebody very rightly pointed out to me, but it's not just about mistakes, you know, also say what's good about it and also react as a piece of writing. Do we write in class or at home? I think that depends on your context, on your situation. there's probably no single right or wrong answer. It may depend on the age of your learners, how independent your learners are, how many hours a week they study, and things like that. I'm aware that I can hear the bells, the tower. We have a clock tower here a few meters from my office, and I can hear it beginning to ring for 2 o'clock in UK time. So I think I have to be quiet and just say again, thank you so much for all coming along.
And take your teaching to new heights.